He never imagined a simple drive home would turn into a fight for his identity, his dignity, and his land. One moment, he was a quiet man returning to the place his family had cherished for generations. The next, he was surrounded by people who looked at him like he didn't belong on soil that carried his own grandfather's footsteps. They spoke to him with certainty, with entitlement, as if he were the outsider trespassing on what was rightfully his. But what they didn't know was that everything they stood on, everything they claimed to own, was built on a lie tied directly to him. And when he discovered the truth, he wouldn't just fight back. He would rewrite everything they thought they controlled. But this was only the beginning. And what he uncovered next would shake an entire community to its core. Jameson had always lived a quiet, steady life, one rooted in the land his family had tended for more than a century. After years of working away from home, he returned hoping to reconnect with the peace he remembered as a boy. The whisper of pines, the glow of sunrise over the fields, the steady rhythm of a place untouched by time. This land wasn't just soil to him. It was memory, legacy, and the last piece his grandfather he still felt connected to. But returning home felt different this time. Neighbors he didn't recognize stared a moment too long. Cars slowed when he passed. People whispered as if he were an outsider stepping into a world that didn't expect him or welcome him. Still, he tried to brush it off. He assumed it was small-town curiosity, the kind that fades once people learn your name. Until the day he drove down the long dirt road toward his childhood home and found the trees cleared, the fields flattened, and rows of expensive homes lining the land that should have been empty. A gated community stood exactly where his grandfather once taught him to fish, where deer used to run freely, where he played as a child. Strangers filled streets that were never meant to exist. Families walked dogs on trails that weren't theirs, and they were looking at him as though he didn't belong. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And the way people watched him that day, with suspicion instead of welcome, with judgment instead of curiosity, was only the beginning, because the truth behind those homes and the people who lived in them was far darker than he could have imagined. And what Jameson uncovered next would turn his quiet return home into a battle no one expected, and no one in that community was prepared for. Jameson stepped out his truck, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The gated entrance, the manicured lawns, the uniform rows of homes that hadn't existed just a few years earlier. None of it belonged here. This was his family's land, a place protected for generations. But when he tried to explore, he quickly learned how the people inside viewed him. The first encounter came fast. A group of homeowners watched him from their porches, their conversations stopping the moment he appeared. Their eyes were cold, scanning him up and down as if trying to place him, yet unwilling to believe he could belong here. A few even pulled their children closer, whispering behind hands. He felt the weight of suspicion pressing on him like a spotlight. It wasn't curiosity. It was something sharper, something that cut deeper, judgment. Still, he walked the streets slowly, letting the reality sink in. These houses stood on soil his grandfather once plowed, on land his father had protected fiercely. But now, the homeowners looked at him like an intruder stepping into a world they believed they owned. And when he reached what should have been his family's southern boundary line, the truth hit him harder than he expected. The markers were gone. The landmarks his grandfather had shown him were bulldozed, replaced by sidewalks and street lamps. Determined to get answers, he went to the county records office. The clerk barely met his eyes, speaking to him in a tone that carried the same thin layer of condescension he'd felt from the homeowners. But when he finally saw the records, everything inside him tightened. According to the documents, the land had been sold a decade earlier. Sold by someone with his family name. Sold using a signature that wasn't his father's, yet had been treated as valid. The forged deed, the notarization that didn't match any real record, the chain of sales that followed. Each page painted a picture of a system that saw him as too small to matter, too insignificant to question. The fraud had gone unchecked because no one expected him to return. No one believed someone like him could own that much land, and no one cared enough to verify the truth. As he dug deeper, he realized the discrimination ran deeper than suspicious looks or whispered conversations. It was embedded in the paperwork, in the oversight, in the assumption that he wasn't the rightful owner of anything that valuable. People had built an entire community on the belief that he wouldn't fight back, or that he didn't have the power to. When he finally visited the neighborhood again, the reaction was immediate. Homeowners marched toward him, led by Karen and Douglas, their expressions twisted with outrage as if he were trespassing on their kingdom. They questioned him, demanded justification, and treated him as if he were a threat. Not a landowner, not a neighbor, a threat. The hostility wasn't subtle. It wasn't hidden. And as it escalated, he realized something chilling. Their confidence didn't come from ignorance. It came from entitlement. They believed the land was theirs because they couldn't imagine it ever belonging to someone like him. And that arrogance, that unshakable belief that he should disappear quietly, only fueled what came next, because what Jameson uncovered after this confrontation wouldn't just confirm the fraud. It would change the fate of the entire community forever and lead to a showdown they never saw coming. Jameson walked into the courthouse knowing the moment he crossed the threshold, everything would change. For 2 years he had endured stares, threats, and endless attempts to silence him. The HOA's lawyers came armed with binders, a wall of suits standing tall, as if their confidence alone could erase the truth. Karen and Douglas sat in the front row, their expressions a mix of anger, arrogance, and a simmering panic they tried to hide. They believed this was their home, their land, their victory to claim, and in their minds, a man like him had no right to challenge them. But the weight of history pressed on his shoulders. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. His father's name, forged and twisted to justify theft, burned inside him. He took his seat beside his attorney, the air thick with tension, the unspoken awareness that he wasn't just fighting for property. He was fighting against something older, heavier, and far uglier. The courtroom fell silent as the judge reviewed the evidence. Page after page revealed the truth. Inconsistencies in signatures, a fake notary stamp, records altered by hands that believed no one would ever question them. The homeowners watched with growing dread. For so long, they had seen him as insignificant, someone who should be grateful just to set foot in their polished community. But now, their entire world rested in the hands of the man they had dismissed, belittled, and treated as if he didn't belong. Then came the moment that shifted everything. The expert witness took the stand. Calm, meticulous, he explained how the original deed had been forged. With each word, the room tightened. Every homeowner who had shouted at Jameson, threatened him, or called him a liar now sat frozen. Karen gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Douglas stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, sweat glistening at his temple. The judge leaned forward, studying the evidence one final time. When the verdict came, it struck like thunder. Ownership of all 1,500 acres reverted to Jameson. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. A few homeowners broke into tears. Someone muttered in disbelief. Karen stood abruptly, shaking her head in outrage, her voice trembling as she insisted the judge reconsider. But her pleas fell flat. This time, the system had chosen truth over entitlement. Jameson didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply breathed, deep, steady, and heavy with the realization of everything he had carried alone for years. But the victory wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. Because as he stepped outside the courthouse, the backlash hit him harder than any legal battle. A crowd waited, angry homeowners waving signs, shouting accusations. They blamed him for their losses, for their fear, for the collapse of a community built on stolen soil. They claimed he was ruining their lives, stealing their homes, attacking their families. Not one of them looked at him with accountability. Only resentment. The sheriff stood between them, but their words pierced anyway. They hurled insults, rage, thinly veiled prejudice. One woman shouted that people like him didn't deserve land that valuable. A man yelled that he should go back to where he came from, ignoring the irony that where he came from was the ground beneath their feet. For a moment, Jameson felt the old fear rise, a fear he knew all too well. The fear of being outnumbered, outshouted, and outcast. The fear of standing alone against a wall of people who saw him as less. But then he remembered why he fought. He remembered the legacy that had been stolen, the quiet pride of generations of his family, the lessons his grandfather taught him under the shade of those towering pines. He stood tall, unmoving, letting their anger wash over him. Because this time, he had the truth on his side. And for the first time in years, the weight of injustice began to lift. But this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because the homeowners still had no idea what their defiance would cost them. And what Jameson chose to do next would reshape the entire community forever. When the verdict settled and the courthouse emptied, Jameson found himself standing at the edge of a battle he thought he had already won. The legal victory was real, undeniable, historic even, but what followed revealed a deeper truth about the world he lived in. The homeowners refused as offered by the land beneath their houses. They rejected every chance to fix what had been built on lies. Instead, they clung to entitlement, convinced that the land was theirs simply because they lived on it, and because they believed someone like him should own something so vast, so valuable, so powerful. And so, the next chapter unfolded. Jameson filed eviction notices, not for the people, but for the property lots themselves. The law was clear. Every structure on the land was his, and every person living there without a valid agreement was trespassing. The homeowners called him a monster. They said he was destroying lives. Some even went on the news, cry about the injustice of losing homes they never should have had in the first place. Not one of them mentioned the forged deeds. Not one of them acknowledged the theft at the heart of their community. The backlash grew uglier. Online posts labeled him a troublemaker. Anonymous emails told him to stay in his place. People who didn't know him, who never cared to, painted him as dangerous, vindictive, ungrateful. But he didn't waver. Because every insult, every threat, every attempt to undermine his would only expose the truth he had been fighting from beginning. They weren't angry because they were losing houses. They were angry because they were losing a false sense of superiority. Then came the moment that changed everything. An investment group approached him with an offer, one that would not only secure his family's legacy, but reshape the land's future. They wanted to purchase all 1,500 acres, homes included, to build a nature preserve and resort. And since the homes were legally fixtures on his land, the sale transferred ownership of every structure as well. The ink dried. The community panicked. Within 30 days, every homeowner was forced to leave. The same people who once sneered at him, who glared when he walked their streets, now packed boxes in shadows of homes they no longer controlled. The clubhouse fell first, then the golf course, the manicured lawns, the artificial perfection built over decades of arrogance. Bulldozers replaced gardeners. Silence replaced chatter. The HOA faded into nothing. And for the first time in years, Jameson felt the land breathe again. He used the money to rebuild his family farmhouse, restoring the soul of the property. He funded a scholarship in his grandfather's name for young agricultural students. He walked the trails as they reappeared through the new preserve, watching deer return to the places they'd been pushed from. The land healed, and so did he. One day, he crossed paths with Douglas, the former HOA president, in a small-town diner. The man who once treated him like an outsider now sat hunched over his coffee, defeated, stripped of the authority he once wielded so casually. He muttered that Jameson had destroyed their community. But Jameson knew the truth. Their downfall began long before he ever came home. It began with a forged signature, a stolen legacy, and a belief that certain people deserve ownership while others don't. This wasn't just about land. It was about the assumptions people make when they look at someone and decide, without knowing anything about them, that they don't belong. It was about how quickly society dismisses the rights of those they underestimate, how systems bend for the powerful while overlooking those who don't fit their picture of ownership, success, or legitimacy. Racism isn't always shouted. Sometimes it's whispered into paperwork, hidden in signatures, buried beneath legal processes that assume certain people will never challenge injustice. Jameson's story wasn't just a property dispute. It was a reminder of how easily people justify taking what isn't theirs when they believe the rightful owner won't fight back. And when the land finally reopened as a public preserve, free, peaceful, restored, former HOA members drove by sometimes, staring through the gates at what used to be their world. But now, the land belonged to everyone. No guards, no restrictions, no hierarchy, just nature, open and alive. As Jameson stood beneath the oak trees his grandfather protected, he understood something powerful. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, legal, right? And it leaves one question echoing long after the dust settles. How many more stories like his will it take before people finally understand that land, opportunity, respect, none of it can be stolen forever?